Welcome to our second special edition in the Economic War Room focused on the Chinese coronavirus pandemic. 3 weeks ago, we had a special episode to warn you about what was coming. We were ahead of the curve. At the time, there were a total of just 60 cases in the United States and no deaths. Now that number is closer, over 7,000, with a death count over 100, like 115. That's more than a 100-fold increase in less than 3 weeks. Worldwide, there are 200,000 plus confirmed cases, and they're approaching 100,000 who are confirmed recovered, with over 8,000 deaths. Now, we're not giving medical advice, we're not giving investment advice, but we're sharing perceptions and insights from the highest levels. And I want you to remember as we start 2 Timothy 1:7. It says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind." And those are three resources we need to deal with this pandemic. In our previous live episode, we explained the virus threat. We explained what a pandemic was. We talked about the health threat, and we provided the Center for Disease Control recommendations regarding mitigation and prevention. The information that we shared in that episode stands largely true today. Federal, state, and local governments have implemented procedures to stop the spread of this potentially deadly disease. Now, we suggested you get a reasonable amount of supplies and food, and that proved to be timely and valuable advice, because if you got it then, the shelves weren't bare when we were talking about it. We predicted that you might have to stay home maybe a couple of weeks, and we provided a list of items that you might need to set aside. This was well before the shelves were bare, and we did not suggest any hoarding. Just get enough to get by for a couple of weeks for your family. Now, we also made an extra effort to tamp down panic. We provided good information for preparation, so don't panic. Go back and watch episode 76 and download the free battle plan. I think you'll find some helpful information there. Now, you have the health advice. That was in the last episode. You get it every night on the news. And we know that COVID-19, or the Chinese coronavirus, or the Wuhan flu, is impacting every aspect of our lives in unprecedented ways. The purpose of this episode is to look beyond. What happens after the virus crisis? How will this change our lives going forward? We know that for the next 2 weeks, we've been instructed to shut down offices, work from home, implement social distancing, close schools, avoid groups of 10 or more, eat at home, sporting events are canceled, homeschooling's on the rise. We know all that's taking place. What do we do after? Increasingly, governments are telling us shelter in place, and so we've got some time to plan, some time to prepare. Now, I want to compare two simulations that the Washington Post put out over the last weekend. The first of these shows the spread of a virus through a closed population without any social distancing. I want you to watch that. As you can see, the vast majority of participants will ultimately get sick. That's if there's no social distancing. Given COVID-19, that would result in a horrific death toll on some of the most vulnerable people in our nation. So watch as the balls bounce around. All right, now we're going to compare that to how social distancing can make a difference. This is why the government has implemented the rules that they have. So let's assume that 7 of 8 people stay in place for 2 weeks. See how it flattens the curve? The goal is to flatten the disease curve so we do not overwhelm the health system. All right, so when you compare it, the free-for-all and social distancing, you see a clear flattening of the curve. And that's the goal of why you're staying home. That's why you're doing what you're doing. Keep 6 feet distance from most people. Don't send everybody to the store. Don't touch things. Use hand sanitizer. If you follow those rules, we will flatten the curve and prevent our health system from literally being overrun as they've experienced in Italy. Now, here's the point. Our nation has chosen to shelter in place, whether it's a top-down mandate or an issue of personal responsibility. It will work. It will flatten the curve. Now, Italy wishes that they'd done this sooner. Korea did this. They started flattening the curve, and they're demonstrating good results. China claims that they've stopped the virus in its tracks, but I'm not so sure that I believe the Chinese statistics. Basically, they said, oh, there's no more virus here. I'm not sure I buy that. But Korea, I do accept. Their efforts are making tremendous progress. I'm going to read to you a quote from Science magazine. The government advised people to wear masks, wash their hands, avoid crowds and meetings, work remotely, and to join online religious services instead of going to churches. Same kind of things we're adopting now. Those with fevers or respiratory illnesses are urged to stay home and watch their symptoms for 3 to 4 days. Now, Korea used extensive testing to identify the problem. But the remedy, once identified, was social distancing, and that's the remedy we're attempting here in the U.S. Now, one of the problems that we've had here is a shortage of tests. And before you go on some rant blaming President Trump, you should know a few key things. There was an old administrative rule requiring all tests to go through the Center for Disease Control. That's a rule that was adopted well before Trump became president, and that sharply limited the availability of testing. Now, the White House found out about that, changed the rule, and while we were supposedly offered tests, there's these claims all over the internet, oh, they were offered tests that they turned them down. That's a fake news. It's not true at all. No one rejected legitimate tests, according to the task force, and some of the tests that were offered, apparently, didn't meet our quality standards. Apparently, they would promote too many false positives, which would have created more panic. But once the administration realized the problem and they provided administrative relief, the free market began to ramp up test production. Private labs can now offer tests. As you can see in the chart from the CDC, Center for Disease Control, the availability of tests through private labs has ramped up sharply and will continue to increase across the country. There are private labs in all 50 states that are offering private tests. And you can see this. The blue or purple line is CDC lab tests, and the orange line is public health labs offering tests. It's ramping up sharply. I imagine in the next couple of weeks we will find many, many tests available. Now, we do not want to test every American. That would be an extreme waste of resources. The officially reported cases in America are under 10,000 right now. What if the truth was 10 times worse than that, or we had 100,000 people infected? That would still be less than 0.3% of the American population. So why would you test everybody for 0.03%? If we had 1 million people infected, that'd be 0.3%. We're not talking a huge population that's likely infected, and we don't want to test everybody. And besides, President Trump made it pretty clear this is not the most pleasant test you will undergo, and we don't want to waste resources. So what we need to do is we need to triage possible patients based on the risk factors that they hold. President Trump mentioned that major tech companies, and he said Google, and then people criticized him for that. It's Verily, which is an Alphabet subsidiary, and Alphabet is Google, but they are preparing plans to triage. That means you go to a website and you put in your risk factors, who you are, your age, and all that, and then you can determine whether or not you need to get a test. Now, I spoke with my friend Ben Newsma of Navigo. Benjamin Newsma showed us a prototype of something he's been working on, and he has a website, and it's something that you can look at. So we had an interview with him earlier. We'll put the interview online on our YouTube and XOTV pages and Facebook pages so you can see the whole interview, because it's fascinating what the tech community is doing. But I want you to look with me, and we're going to take a COVID-19 assessment right here. And they'll put the website covid-19.navigo.cc on the screen. So if you want to take this assessment, I'm going to do it really quickly. Where do you live? Am I at risk from COVID-19? It says, where do you live? Well, I live in the United States. All right. Are you sick? No. How old are you? Well, it's down me up to, I hate to share my age, but 58. Male or female? Male. No major medical issues. I don't smoke. I frequent higher traffic public spaces? Yeah, often. How often do you travel? Frequently. How often do you wash your hands? Well, right now, frequently, 5 or more times a day. I have not visited a high transmission area or been with an infected person. Results, small chance of contracting the coronavirus, and I'm at lower risk if I did, needing medical attention. And that's it. Now I'm going to retake that assessment and I'm going to do it as if there were problems. I live in the United States. Am I sick? I'm not, but I'll say yes. High temperature, yes. Continuous dry cough, yes. Incredibly fatigued, yes. Coughing up, yes. Shortness of breath. How old are you? I'm going to ramp it up and say I'm 81, male, and I've got one major medical issue, and I smoke at least once a week. I frequent higher traffic places, and I travel every week, and I wash my hands 2 to 3 times a day. I have visited, I'll say this, spent time at a high transmission center, high risk, possible that I have COVID-19. It recommends that I get tested. That's how simple it is. You can go there. If you feel a cough, if you feel a little warmer than normal, if whatever you're feeling symptoms, this is a good first step to see if you're in need of medical attention. So let's go back. I think that we Americans can make a difference, and we can learn about this, and we can address it. If we're able to triage patients based on risk factors, we'll get ahead of this. So Ben, thank you very much for what you're doing. Now, what can we learn from this is that America may be slow in responding, and we have been a little slower in responding than I would like, but when we can, we do, and free enterprise wins out. That was true in World War I, that was true in World War II, and that's true in the Cold War. But economic freedom coupled with personal liberty, ingenuity, and creativity will win in the end. Here's a famous quote attributed to Winston Churchill, although he probably never said it. It is, "Americans always do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else." I'd put it another way. Americans are often slow to respond, but when we do, you can always count on us for victory. Now, there are second order effects that I'm concerned about. I have no doubt that we're going to conquer COVID-19, but we're undertaking serious measures, and these will change the way we live our lives in unexpected ways. There are risks and there are opportunities, and we want to help identify the opportunities as well as the risks so that you're prepared to deal with them. And to be prepared for times like these, we need to heed the words of author Rudyard Kipling. He wrote a famous poem, If. If you've never read If, you should read it. Now, I'll read the poem at the end of this episode, but basically it's about keeping your head when everything seems crazy. We need that wisdom now. Now let's review what we said on February 29th regarding the economic impact of the threat. We said the impact will be significant if infections spread in the U.S. True. Imagine if everyone stays home for weeks. True. Could last until June, optimistically. Unfortunately, true. Reinfection rate will be the key, and that's not known yet. It's still not known, and it will hurt U.S. factories, retail, restaurants, and travel. We're dealing with all of those things right now. Now, we also said on the economic impact, we said at a minimum it would knock 0.5% off U.S. GDP this year. Well, I'm here to tell you it's going to be far worse than that. In fact, we said if it's a pandemic, and it is, it would be far worse, maybe even a recession. Well, that's what we're facing right now. But we had good news. We said there's a potential for a V-shaped recovery. Lost business can spring back for some industries. If you're like in the car or the home sale industries, in World War II, there was pent-up demand. People couldn't buy cars and they couldn't buy homes. And after the war ended, then they went out and purchased. And it caused an economic boom. If you're in the restaurant business, it's going to be tougher sledding. It's going to be a lot harder. Hopefully you'll make up for it in to-go business and so forth, but it's going to be hard to keep your doors open. Remember, pandemics happen. They happen every 25 to 30 years. We told you that in the last episode, but we recover and life goes on. Unfortunately, a few people will suffer harm, great harm in this. I don't want to minimize the tragedy, but recovery is inevitable. And I said, likely the Federal Reserve and Central Bank would produce stimulus. We're already seeing lower rates. It might produce a V-shaped recovery. We're seeing the stimulus package being hammered out right now. The Fed is active, and we're now seeing the Congress acting as well. Now, what's happened since we last covered this? Well, the World Health Organization declared this a pandemic on March 14th. And it's gotten far worse than a small blip in GDP. In fact, we're now estimating the decline in the economy to be 6 to 8% over the next 3 months. That means a negative 6 to 8%, a drop in our economy. That's recession, that's bad recession terms. Now it sounds obvious. Nobody's shopping, we're not spending, we're not traveling, people are losing their jobs or at least being laid off for a few weeks. Remember though, we've been through hard times before. At least with this one, we know what caused it and we'll know when it's getting better. And it will be temporary. Now, what's ahead? I want to quote from Barron's in the Up and Down Wall Street column from this past weekend. It says, real GDP contracted at an 8.0% annual rate in the second quarter of 1980, only slightly less than the 8.4% annualized decline in the fourth quarter of 2008. The latter episode memorably followed the failure of Lehman Brothers and the ensuing crisis. Now remember, in 1980, interest rates were at record highs. Now they're near record lows. In 2008, the financial system was collapsing. Today, it is solvent. So if we could recover then, we can certainly do so now. And believe me, the 1980s, we had a huge economic run-up out of the 1980s, and we've recovered since 2008, and the stock market went up quite a bit since the lows when the Dow was 6,500 in March of 2008. Now, I'm not offering investment advice, but there are a few things to note from what we said 3 weeks ago. We said the market was at all-time highs, and that was true 10 days before that. That was like February 19th, we're at an all-time high in the market. We said corrections are normal, and we were approaching a 10% decline, which should happen at least annually, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. And then we said that bear markets also happen. And we said we hadn't had one in a long time, but if we did, it would be a decline of at least 20%. Well, it's already, we're in a bear market right now. But then we said markets do recover after pandemics. They always have, and that clears out speculation. So I want you to take a look at this. This is the fastest fall to bear market territory in history. In 19 days, it took just 19 days for the market to fall from the peak to February 12th to the bear market territory. That's the fastest one ever in history. Now, as you know, last Friday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 2,000 points. It was one of the largest gains in history, sparked by promises of Fed money. Then on Monday, it fell 3,000 points when people realized that things were shutting down around the country. And yesterday, the Dow gained 1,000 points, and today it was down almost 2,000 points. What do these swings mean? What it means is we're in a bear market. That's normal activity when people are panicking and don't know what to do. When you have moves of 8%, 10%, 12% in a matter of hours, that's typical of bear markets. You have massive run-ups, but you also have massive declines. But right now, stocks are off over 30% from their peak, and that still hurts. Let's watch the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Here it starts 5 years ago, and we're back to almost where we were 5 years ago. 5 years of gains wiped out that quickly. You should not be surprised by a bear market. We've covered this risk for 2 years. We talk about it in the Economic War Room all the time. In fact, in episode 5, we featured John Malden and David Tice. Watch this.
I do believe that's a real possibility because, a lot of times markets don't end, like this and then crash. A lot of times they end like this and then they crash.
Yeah. So we were warning about a coming bear market, but David Tice and John Malden both sat here in this studio and said we might have a melt up first. And that was just before 2019 and the extraordinary gains we had that year. Now, they weren't giving advice, they're just telling you practically the kind of things that can happen in normal stock markets. This isn't abnormal behavior, this is what bear markets are like. So we went straight up after that show, episode 5, and now we're experiencing that collapse that David Tice said could happen. He said the next bear market could cause a 40% drop. We're feeling that right now. So what's next? I want to give you 2 quotes from my mentor, the great Sir John Marks Templeton. He was my boss for several years. He said, every bull market is followed by a bear market, and every bear market is followed by a bull market. So if you're in a bull market, you should be looking for the exit sign. You should be ready to get out at some point and taking cash off the table. But if you're in a bear market, what do? You look for entry points. You look for buying opportunities. And that's what you should begin to do with your advisor right now. I'm not saying jump in today. I can't advise you on that. I don't know your situation. But you ought to talk with your advisor and say, are there any great companies that I can buy shares right now at bargain prices? The people who did that in 2009 are very happy they did. Same thing for those who did it at the trough in the early 2000s or in the 1987 crash or in the Asian crash in 1997. Every bear market is ultimately followed by a bull market. The other thing John Templeton said is he said to buy when others are despondently selling and to sell when others are greedily buying requires fortitude but pays the greatest potential reward. 2 months ago, people were greedily buying. It was hard to sell, hard to raise cash. Today, people are panic selling. It requires fortitude, but sometime in here, I can't tell you where the bottom is, I have no idea. But sometime in here, when people are panic selling, that's the moment you'll want to buy. Talk to your advisor. We're not giving investment advice. We're sharing wise principles that I've learned in my almost 40 years in the investment industry. And there are things that you can learn too. Now, this is a time for me to tell you about Liberty University and the plans that we have to offer NSIC, National Security Investment Consultant training to investment advisors so that they can learn to manage money for you. If you want to learn more, go to nsic.org, and we hopefully will have online training classes with Liberty University coming up in the next several months. So check out the battle plan for this episode and stay tuned to Economic War Room for more details. Now, if you want to invest, what things would you look for? Well, you might look for the stocks of some great companies selling at ridiculously low valuations. I saw Jim Cramer on CNBC, and one of his recommendations is to look for accidental high yielders. What does that mean? That means a company with a solid balance sheet that has good revenues that will be able to continue to pay its dividend and has a long dividend paying history. Maybe that company is paying more in dividends than it's offering in yield in its 10-year bonds. That's an accidental high yielder. Because the stock price has come down so much, the dividend is a very high yield. You might look at something like that. Look for companies with good balance sheet and survivors that can roar back when the virus fades. And maybe look at the industries that will benefit going forward, such as telemedicine, retailers getting into medicine. I mean, there's this whole trend. Walmart's going to be offering medicine because people are going to be going to the Walmart parking lot to get their COVID-19 test. Well, Walmart has opened their first clinics. Walgreens, CVS, American businesses that are retail businesses that may be getting into medicine, or companies like pharma companies that may be bringing back manufacturing onshore and no longer dependent upon China. We're also looking for any American business that is onshoring its manufacturing, or technology companies that help you work from home. Those are the kind of industries you can talk with your advisor. Maybe this looks good. I have no idea what your situation is, how long you can invest. I can tell you this, if you can't put the money and leave it alone for 3 years, preferably 5 years, you shouldn't be buying stocks. But if you can, talk to your advisor and see if you can find a good opportunity to buy good stocks at good prices soon. Now, we expect an infrastructure package as the Congress appears to be in a spending mood. This has many implications for American businesses. So we may be rebuilding our infrastructure. If the government can borrow money at cheap rates, and currently they can, they may be borrowing a lot of money and putting it into infrastructure. And we also might want to look at medical companies that develop novel treatments, like biotech companies that will deal with some of the issues that this COVID-19 pandemic are causing. And you want to look at other entrepreneurs. Glenn Beck on his program featured an inventor in Italy who was able to literally 3D print ICU valves that were in short supply in Italy. Entrepreneurs, this is a time for them. They can rise up to help us address the shortage problems and other issues that we're having. Again, talk to your investment advisor. Make sure you have a properly balanced portfolio. We're not offering advice here. We're recommending you get advice. I want to also point out, as we did in the last episode, that on February 4th, the SEC put out a warning. It says, "We urge investors to be wary of promotions and to be aware of the substantial potential for fraud during this time." And its title was, "Look out for coronavirus-related investment scams." People that say, hey, here's the silver bullet solution, don't believe that. Go to the SEC website, we put a link in the battle plan, and read up on what they're warning you about. Don't get caught in a fraud here. Buy good quality companies. If you're eligible to buy stocks, if that's right and appropriate for you, buy good quality companies, good balance sheets, and good potential. Now, here's something you may not know. We all know interest rates have fallen precipitously, and in fact, the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate that they charge down to 0. That's their target rate, 0%. But in the past few days, the market rates have actually been rising. 10-year and 30-year Treasury bond rates sold in the market were well below 1% on the 10-year basis and at the lowest levels on the 30-year bond in a long, long time. They've moved up the past couple of days. Why? The reason is anybody who's watching television knows that the Congress is talking about spending $1 trillion, $2 trillion or more, and they know government borrowing is going to increase. This will be good for the banks at first because banks make money, the differential between what they have to pay for money and what they can charge for money is widening. That's the spread. And when it widens, banks are more profitable. And that's going to be good for the financial service industry if it holds true. But this also creates what we call a second-order problem. There are very real risks down the road coming from the potential rise in interest rates. Easily, we see $1 trillion added to the deficit. That'll put us past $25 trillion very quickly. And people may get used to the government handouts. They're talking about giving every person $1,000 or every family $2,000 or even more. And people will build a dependence on that if it lasts very long. At the same time, this is going to put pressure on the American dollar. Global Times did a report that said China would lessen their holdings in advance of what they perceive to be widespread spending by our government. Now in the next episode, and it comes out tomorrow if you're watching it live. If you're watching this live, otherwise it will be released on March 19th, and it's an episode featuring Dr. Gal Luft on de-dollarization. You'll want to pick that up. You'll want to watch episode 79 because that's a risk. When you add these things together, tax cuts, extreme deficit spending, an easy Federal Reserve, and modern monetary theory, which says you can spend as much as you want and it won't have repercussions, the reality of that is it always ends in hyperinflation. We don't want to go down that road. We want to get this thing under control as quickly as possible, rein in the government spending as quickly as possible. Otherwise, the dollar could lose its reserve currency status, and if we did that, we would be in a position similar to Zimbabwe or Weimar Germany or Venezuela if we kept spending at this massive deficit rate. So we've got to avoid that. That is a second-order effect and something we have to worry about. Now, there's also a concern, which is an oil price war. And we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but the price of oil has dropped precipitously. It's well below $25 a barrel. I looked at 22 earlier today. And you can look this up at oilprice.com and look at West Texas Intermediate crude and see what the oil price is. Let me look at that right now. We'll go over here, oil price chart, and we'll refresh. $20.98 right now. $20.98. This oil price was $60 a barrel not long ago. This is very inexpensive. That's going to have an impact. If you drive much, and people aren't driving as much right now, which is part of the reason oil prices have come down, but if you drive much, you're going to get much cheaper gasoline as a result from this. But if oil prices stay down this low, it will harm our shale industry. The American energy renaissance that's taken place under President Trump and actually started under President Obama, where we started with fracking and shale development, that has literally transformed the energy of the world. We are no longer dependent on foreign countries. But American energy companies will not necessarily be able to stick around when prices are that low. So when you look at this, here's a chart from Platts.com, Russia more resilient to cheap oil than most other nations. Qatar requires less than $50 a barrel, Russia $50 a barrel, Iran $200 a barrel almost. Why do I share that? Because we're in the midst of an oil price war on top of a pandemic. And this war is between Saudi Arabia and Vladimir Putin. And Putin and Saudi Arabia have just said, we're not going to cut back production. We're going to actually increase production and flood the world with extra oil even as demand is going down. And that's why we're seeing $20 a barrel oil. Russia is better prepared than Saudi Arabia, as you can see from this chart, to withstand lower prices, but even Russia will be hurt. You got to keep in mind the Russian people are very strong. They resisted the Nazi invasion for quite some time. Russia can withstand a lot of hardship, but this is going to hurt. Now I have good news, and my friend Rod Martin tells me about the good news, and it really is that even if our shale industry is hurt, and there are bankruptcies in the shale community, and I hope that's not the case, but even if that does prove to be the case, we can recover it. We have a great bankruptcy system. The oil is still there. The technology is still there. And so if Saudi Arabia and Russia drive the price down, put our companies into bankruptcy, God forbid, we will be able to recover even that. The technology will be there and we'll start ramping up production again. We do not ever have to be dependent again on Saudi Arabia or even Russia. So that's good news. The bad news is there's political risk. And here's the political risk. And there's one big threat. And we've talked about it, and we'll talk about it again in episode 80. So not the one coming out with Gal Luft on 79 that's this week, but the next week is episode 80, and that's called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance Investing. And millennials have demanded that their universities, the pensions, all big pools of money divest from fossil fuels. No more investment in the fossil fuel industry. Well, we need that investment available so that we can recover our shale industry. So that's a threat we'll have to deal with, and it's bad news that's down the road. The second aspect of bad news is the risk of an election. And what I mean by that is the Trump economy was absolutely fantastic up to the moment of the COVID virus. Now I can imagine in the White House, the political advisors said, hey, let's not shelter in place, that's going to hurt the economy. And they were maybe doing some of the things that other nations said, oh, keep spending. President Trump, to his credit, stepped out and said, no, this is a serious issue. The health of Americans is more important, and I'm willing to take the political risk of the economy slowing down. But it's a serious risk. If the economy collapses and we don't recover by the election, and there's this big push to blame President Trump, and I'm telling you, the media and the Democratic Party and the socialists and the globalists are all pointing that direction, then we could see a Biden or Sanders presidency. I think Sanders may be about to drop out, but he has pulled Joe Biden so far to the left that Joe Biden, the former vice president, is talking anti-fracking. In fact, he was talking banning all fracking. That's a dangerous thought, putting us energy dependent once again on Saudi Arabia, OPEC, the Middle East, and Russia. We don't want that. He's talking about immigration. I won't deport anybody unless they've caused a serious crime or committed a felony. I'm not going to deport anybody. Really? That's an open call. People, come on in and you're not going to get deported. You know what? That's the worst thing we could do in a global pandemic. Even the European Union is closing their borders. We can't have such bad immigration policies. I hope people are listening. He's talking about gun control. He's going to give it over to Robert Francis O'Rourke, Beto O'Rourke, and say, I'm going to put you in charge of gun control and mandatory federally funded abortion. Are these the things you want? And do you really think that Joe Biden would do a better job handling this pandemic? I certainly disagree with that. We cannot give up our liberties, our freedoms, just because we're a little scared of this virus. What's going to happen? How President Trump handles this crisis will likely determine who gets elected this year. And the media is all in attacking him. Well, I say they're all in attacking him. There are a couple of examples, and I'm proud of the examples of truth-telling from some parts of the media and even some political parties, like the governor of New York, the governor of California, have both lauded President Trump's response in various parts. Now keep in mind, President Trump was ahead on this. The issue of test shortages, that wasn't anticipated. Maybe it should have been, but I'm not at all believing that Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, or any of them would have done anything differently in that respect. And in fact, they would have had a strong government approach, and what President Trump did is genius. He called in the corporations and he said, we're going to have a private enterprise approach. And so we've got American companies creating test kits in private labs, and we're going to see a much different picture soon. The old regulations prevented faster action. All the tests were scheduled to go through the CDC, and that was not a Trump decision. Biden wouldn't have done any better, neither would Sanders. There's so much fake news on this. You know, there's a fake news claim that we turned down all these tests. That's not true. You heard the task force in their press conference saying, we didn't turn down a bunch of tests. Some tests that we looked at were getting false positives. Can you imagine how bad it would be if there were false positive tests going out there and the panic that would happen? So we've got to make sure that they're good and legitimate tests. But don't blame President Trump. That is an unfair attack. Free enterprise is on the case. They're ramping up capabilities now. Now, there are some other fake news on this. In fact, they said there was ads, campaign ads that were run that said Donald Trump called the coronavirus a hoax. That's not true. He never did. In fact, the Washington Post gave that 4 Pinocchios. The Washington Post said it's an absolute lie. There were false claims about what he was doing. That was the hoax. But he never said the coronavirus was a hoax. Every single word the president issues is carefully parsed to discredit him. President Trump said Google was helping. Technically, it was Verily, which is owned by Google, aka Alphabet. So, yeah, you can attack him, but Verily put out a tweet, said, yes, we are working on this. Lots of fake news, lots of political risk. You need to stay tuned to Blaze TV. Watch all the hosts on Blaze TV. You can use the Econ to get a discount when it asks for you the code to put in. Use ECON and get a discount. But you need to be watching Glenn Beck and Mark Levin and Steven Crowder and Steve Deese and all of the hosts to get good, accurate news. There's a lot of political risk, and we're going to have to be educated so that we fight the political battle before the election. Now, some in the media are actually very honest, and I want to applaud Chief Political Correspondent for CNN, Dana Bash, because she complimented the president for his recent tone. Let's take a look at this clip.
If you look at the big picture, this was remarkable from the President of the United States. This is a nonpartisan, this is an important thing to note and to applaud from an American standpoint, from a human standpoint. He is being the kind of leader that people need, at least in tone, today and yesterday, right, in tone that people need and want and yearn for in times of crisis.
We hope the American people take a hard look at the candidates to decide who they believe will be best to deal with a crisis like this one. What Dana Bash pointed out is President Trump is actually doing a pretty good job right now with the tone. It's bipartisan. He's not trying to make political points here. He's actually trying to deal with a crisis. We suggest you take a long, hard look and favor the candidate who endorses freedom, liberty over socialism, which would be horrible. Look at the economies that have socialized medicine now and how they're struggling to keep up with this. They don't have private enterprise capable of ramping up production on tests and all the other things that we need. We need free enterprise. We don't need socialized medicine. Now, there's also another election risk. Do you remember the Iowa caucus? Remember how bad that was and how they didn't have a winner for days and it could have been hacked? And we've talked about that. I want you to go back and look at episodes 20 and 21, and I want you to see the election fraud risk that we face. They're talking about maybe, well, if we have a virus, we put all the election online. We cannot subject our democracy to that form of potential manipulation by hacking and everything else. Go back and watch the shows, episodes 20 and 21, download the battle plans, and stand up for free and fair elections. Now, there's another opportunity, and it's also a risk. And this is a geopolitical opportunity. China is under stress. They're reporting that they've got this virus under control, but you look at YouTube clips and other media that sneaks out of the country, and you realize they actually don't have everything under control. But they're claiming that they do. That's because the Chinese government, the Communist Party, is under stress. They're pretending the economy is restored, but is that real? People there feel lied to. They probably have prisoners working in the factories. So we have to beware the wounded dragon, because the Chinese Communist Party could collapse from this, but we absolutely have to make sure that they don't lash out. And they're already lashing out. They're trying to blame this on American servicemen, military coming over to China and spreading the virus. It's simply not true. But they're lashing out and they're threatening, and we've got to keep a close eye and monitor that. We have to beware the wounded dragon. Now, there are a lot of unanswered questions, but the smoke is beginning to clear a little bit. Stay tuned to Economic War Room. We're going to bring you specials like this live edition. We're going to also bring you regular clips that we're going to put out on our YouTube channel and XOTV, and we're going to give you every week episodes that are timely and important. We cover the critical topics. We need this nation to have clear heads, to have good information and clear heads. Fortunately, there was a proclamation from President Trump. Last Sunday was a national day of prayer. That's one of the things we said we need. Because if you calm, if you pray, if you get in tune spiritually, you can have a clearer head and make better decisions. Now, when I wrap up, I'm going to wrap up by reading Rudyard Kipling's If poem. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to read some of it. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your head, heart, and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch. If neither foes nor living friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son. We're facing a challenge. It may be a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to rebuild America, to reset your family and your finances if we keep our heads. EconomicWarRoom.com is where you can download this special episode battle plan. We'll put it out in a couple of days. It'll have summary, action steps, and links to articles. But you need to stay tuned. And you need to pray for health, for wisdom, for blessing. Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. And right now, we're facing a health war and a spiritual war. It's a time to call on God, to ask Him to heal our land. That's what Chronicles says, 2 Chronicles 7:14. We'll be His people, call by His name, humble ourselves and pray, seek His face, turn from our wicked ways, then He'll hear from heaven, forgive our sin, and heal our land. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.